Hi everyone, we're going to do something slightly different today. The topic is still going to be swords, but we're going to do a book review. I had a birthday recently, and my niece was kind enough to send me this. It is History of the Sword by Dover Coloring Books. This was written more than 20 years ago, before HEMA was a thing. This was sent to me again by my niece, Lily. So, Lily, if you're out there watching, thank you very much for this. I am going to appreciate it, and after I'm done recording, I'll have to start coloring it. And I thought this would be an opportunity to take a look at, to see where we've come. There's lots of publications out there, historical and otherwise. This is attempting to give a spectrum of what type of swords there are out there. And I thought it would be interesting to see, if we go back more than 20, almost 25 years, to see what the perception was of what swords there are, and how that compares to where things are today. It starts us off with a sickle sword, and it's nice that they call it a sickle sword instead of just khopesh, because again, there were swords used throughout the Mesopotamian era for hundreds of years in the Bronze Age throughout the region. Khopesh is a name more associated with their use within Egypt, but they were found much further away than just Egypt. This looks like a style that was perhaps more common in the region of the Levant. If we skip ahead a little bit, let's see what else we can find. We have a nice Celtic sword. This specific type of bronze Celtic sword is called an antenna sword. That is a type that has been found. I don't know that it's typically seen with this 3-stud configuration. I'll have to double check that. So they're playing a little fast and loose with this configuration of features, but on the whole, I'd say that that's kind of fair. The Babylonian sword, it looks like they are perhaps a little creative, shall we say, with the type of features that the Babylonian iron sword had. There were short iron swords from the golden age of Babylon around the 7th century before Christ. They tended to be short, and they tended to be straight and double-edged. As to them having exactly those features, I'm not so sure about that. Let's see what other ones we can find that might be of interest to us. If we go forward to the time of the Crusades, they have swords from 2 very famous historical features. We have the sword of Richard the Lionheart, and the sword of Sultan Saladin, as he's called. This sword of Richard the Lionheart, to me, looks very much like something that might have been produced by Marto of Spain. So it is bedecked with lions all over the place. And it is not particularly faithful to arming swords that we would see in the late 12th century. So those swords generally would have wider crosses. We wouldn't see this prominent ricasso here. This is something that we really don't see starting until really I wouldn't say we'd even really see them until the beginning of the 15th century. And the pommel is interesting. There are all sorts of different types of pommels, and if you're a wealthy person, you can have a fancy pommel, so I wouldn't rule it out. But that particular configuration, I don't think, has ever been attributed to Richard. And they've given Saladin a scimitar, or a curved sword. So what's the truth of this? Now, if we look at the period illustrations of the Crusades, especially those found in Europe, it's very common to see the European crusaders with the typical cruciform straight swords, and not uncommon to see the Saracens, the Muslim antagonists in the European Christian illustrations, as having some type of single-edged sword. Not always. Sometimes they have pretty much the exact same gear, and you have to kind of know who you're looking at in order to figure out who is who. But sometimes they will have single-edged swords. So did they have sabers at the time? The question is very complicated. The fact of the matter is, if you're looking at illustrations, what we now call scimitar, they would not have been using that term. That's a term that doesn't really show up until the 14th century, and it starts in Italy. What we're looking at is actually, in most cases, a falchion. So it's a sword that started in Europe and was used starting perhaps in France in the middle of the 13th century. And it becomes an artistic shorthand for showing someone who is villainous, if shall we say, in whatever the context of the illustration that you're depicting is. So for instance, in the story of David and Goliath, Goliath is often depicted wielding a curved, single-edged sword, a falchion. In the Muslim world at this time, the majority of swords were straight and double-edged and not that dissimilar from the swords we see in Europe. They tend to have slightly shorter quillons, so they're not quite as long, but the types of blades are very, very similar. They're just called a safe. It's just called a sword. Single-edged swords are seen, but they're less common, and they're not common among the Arabs. They're common among the Turkic peoples that get incorporated into the greater Muslim world. So depending on what groups you're seeing, you'll see more or less of them. It wouldn't be likely that Salah ad-Din would have a curved sword at this time, and certainly not one that looked like this. They look quite a bit different. They'd have a very long, thin, straight blade and just a very simple cross and a bit of more of a straight hilt at the end there. What else is interesting? Anything else that we can learn? Just taking a quick glance, the designs of some of these swords, they have the sword of Robert the Bruce and a member of the Knights Templar. These designs are very interesting, and I see them if I'm looking at signs for decorative swords that you can still purchase today. So it's interesting that a lot of these designs that you find for swords that are not functional but are decorative are designs that were developed perhaps in the 1980s or 1990s, and they persist today, and they haven't been developed any further. And they're not really, they don't have a lot of basis in historical designs for swords. They're creative, shall we say, with only taking only inspiration from history. We have a sort of an Italian man-at-arms, and he is wielding a cinquedea. Is that fair? I'll give them points for including a cinquedea dated to 1480. Yeah, that's a little early perhaps, but that's okay. Would it be for a man-at-arms? Maybe a very well-to-do man-at-arms. This is actually one of the earliest types of like dedicated civilian swords that didn't have a lot of martial connotations. In some ways, it's the precursor of a true rapier, of what the rapier would become. So they get partial credit. I'll give them a B+ for that. And a two-handed Scottish Highlander. This type of long sword or great sword is a Highland style sword, sometimes called a claymore. That name is contentious, so I tend not to use it. I'll call it a two-handed Highland sword. And then we also have, what's the most problematic? This is probably the most problematic page, I'd say. So we'll start off with one from my buddy iPost Swords. This is a cavalry saber of a Polish hussar. So the Polish szabla, the war sabers from starting in the 16th century and going forward, come in many, many different configurations. They are typically very long-bladed, and they have a variety of different hilts. They're known for often having a special place to have your thumb ring. And they have kind of distinctive knuckle guards in many cases. I have never seen this particular configuration of hilt, and this is a very generic-looking blade that's not typical of any of the more famous-looking Szabla Polska. So I don't think that this is a very fair shake of the famous Polish Szabla. And then over here we have an English cross-hilted rapier. That is a really interesting term, and the blade that they've chosen for it, to me, looks like a 19th century Highland officer's sword. The dress swords that you find for Highland officers instead of a basket-hilted sword. Sometimes you get these throwback cross, simple cruciform swords. That's really interesting. I wouldn't call this a rapier. So rapier is always described as a very ill-defined term because there's so many different swords that could be called rapier. Add this to the mix, guys. I have never seen that particular sword called a rapier before, but this book by Dover Coloring is called a rapier, apparently. Here's another interesting one. So they have a short sword of an Italian nobleman. They didn't get the name, but they got it right. This is a storta, and it's dated right, and it looks correct. And then we have a basket-hilted broadsword of a Spanish conquistador. This is a Venetian Schiavona by any other name. So I don't think it really belongs on the Spanish conquistador, but they got the look right. Anyway, so it's a little trip through memory lane back into the 90s. It's a fun little book. I think I could recommend it. I wouldn't recommend it as an educational piece, but it is fun, and it's something to see kind of how far we've come. Once again, thank you, Lillian, for the book. I am going to enjoy coloring it. Take care.